I think it's always difficult in a conflict to get at the truth. You know, there's one story on one hand, another story on another hand, and people living thousands of miles away who don't have really direct contacts with the conflict are probably going to be extremely disadvantaged in actually getting to know what actually is the truth and the true position. And in situations like that, right, there are groups, particularly overseas, right, who have sometimes portrayed a picture of this country which has always not been very accurate. A balanced picture has not been portrayed.
There was something slightly wrong in Sri Lanka. At one point, somebody said in Parliament that we have spent more time under emergency rule or any other type of rule than under normal law. And this goes back a long time.
We are a country with at least 3 nationalities. The Sinhalese, 75%, Tamils, 15%, Muslims, 10%. And in the system of democracy we have, which is a centralized one, with one presidency, one parliament, with overriding powers, the Sinhalese majority, who are 75%, are able to elect a Sinhalese president, a parliament which is dominated by Sinhalese, who then can take decisions by themselves unilaterally that impact upon the minority nationalities.
During the colonial period, there was a strong feeling among the majority Sinhala people on the island that they had been disadvantaged, and the minorities, and particularly the Tamil minority, had been received an advantage in terms of education, positions in government and so forth. So this perception among the Sinhalese naturally led to the fact that they were going to reverse it after independence came and majority rule came. And that's what happened.
Sri Lanka was the first non-European or non-white, if I can use that term, colony to be given adult universal suffrage. We've been voting in this country since 1931. Right up to the 1970s, we were getting rid of governments through the ballot box with great frequency. We were hailed in terms of sort of political science textbooks as the example of a parliamentary democracy in the developing world.
And I don't think we've ever actually looked at the impact of a British constitutional system which is majoritarian. Once you get a majority, you can do anything in Parliament. And it works in Britain because there are certain conventions, and also it's a reasonably homogeneous population. Class is more important than anything else in Britain. But in Sri Lanka, this majoritarianism led to decisions that I think militated against the minorities.
The Tamils and the Sinhalese were together in their demand for independence from the British. And after the British left in February of 1948, the main Tamil party actually was a part of the then governing party, the United National Party led government. But later there was a breakaway group that break away from the from the government and formed their own party called the Federal Party.
One political party, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, was created and won an election based purely on serving the needs of the majority community. So what happens once they came into power, they were beholden to that majority community to really, fulfill their electoral promises, and thereby started to discriminate against minority, bring in a Sinhala language only policy where, the state language suddenly from overnight went from English to Sinhala, and therefore the minority communities, particularly the Tamil community, was disadvantaged, overnight.
The Tamils are very upset that their language was not made an official language, but they could do nothing to stop it. Tamil is spoken by both the Muslims and the Tamils. So 25% of the people spoke Tamil, but the language of the 75% was made the only official language. There were many other examples where, when the interests of the Sinhalese and the interests of the ethnic minorities clashed, the decision went in favor of the Sinhalese, and gradually the Tamils began to realize that they could never get a just answer, or it was difficult to get a just answer from Sinhalese-dominated governments. It is that provided them with the reason to try and break away from the country.
In 1956, Sinhalese was made the official language. Tamil was not made the official language, and they said therefore the Tamils became second-class citizens. In my view, that was not the correct interpretation, because from independence to 1956, English was the official language, and both Sinhalese and Tamils were second-class citizens in our own country. It was the elite who ruled. In 56, they made Sinhalese the official language. The mistake they made was they didn't also make Tamil the second. So that what happened was Sinhalese came into their own, but the Tamils were left where they were. They were not actually pushed back, they were where they were. And the Sinhala only was not aimed at discriminating the Tamils, but it was aimed at empowering the local natives.
A comparatively larger group of Tamils, those have been under British people, and they have been working very closely. So those were getting more job opportunities during the British period, colonial period, that has been there. So then this has been a big disadvantage for the majority.
Language was probably the key issue that erupted in the mid-1950s, and a Trotskyite politician, very well known parliamentarian, Dr. Colvin R. De Silva, he made a famous statement in Parliament when language policy was debated in 1956 in Colombo, that if we have one language, he warned the country that there will be two countries, but if we have two languages, we will have one country.
And then in 1976, the major Tamil party passed a resolution at their convention that if we cannot find suitable political arrangements, maybe the pathway is open for actually creating a separate state within the Sri Lankan state.
And it is always a small section of people whose voices are out of proportion to the numbers that they actually possess, who create these disruptions, sow the seeds of suspicion, create insecurities among communities that causes a lot of these problems. But in Sri Lanka, the people themselves for many years have lived together, helped each other without major problems.
The polarization of the politics was led by the elite themselves. There were members of the elite who wanted political power. So they manipulated the minds of the rural voters and said, you know, this is what we can deliver for you. So I think, you know, it's rather than lack of experience, I think it was a very shrewd political game played by a few elite people who wanted to come to power doing anything. And the rural people just followed them. So I really don't, you know, I don't think anybody understood the consequences of what they were doing. You know, it took decades to see the negative effects.
Up to the mid to late 1970s, Tamil political action was twofold. One was to try to get negotiated settlements with whoever was in government, but all of those failed. When they failed, it was non-violent protest of Satyagraha. In fact, 2012 constitutes 50 years after the first Satyagraha in 1962. So the attempt at compromise, of negotiation, of using the parliamentary forum failed.
Unfortunately, with the emergence of the LTT and the dominance of the LTT, and because of the fear that everybody had to stand up to the LTT if they disagree, the Tamil National Alliance also took a back seat and said that the LTT are the sole representatives of the Tamil people. Though the Tamil National Alliance was elected by the people, they preferred to leave the ground for the LTT.
When the ITAK decided to become a partner of the government, these people thought they had been betrayed. In fact, that groundswell of opinion was so strong within the Tamil community of this impression of betrayal of the main Tamil party joining the government, of having given up the cause. That impression was so strong that the ITAK was too scared even to accept a portfolio.
And then what happened was, because of successive policies, and the policy in particular of the government in power between 1970 and 77 in the field of education, a lot of the Tamil youth who were shut out of the university system were forced into taking up arms.
One of the reasons, I believe, was the standardization of marks in entry to universities, where there was a time when Tamil students found themselves placements much more than their Sinhala counterparts, and the mark system was sort of changed in order to accommodate more of the students from the south.
The Tamils play a very great importance to education, and historically when the British and so on developed educational institutions, particularly in Colombo, in Jaffna, the Tamils lapped up the education. They were the first to come forward to educate themselves, and a lot of them got into government service. They became engineers, doctors. So by the time we got independence, the Tamil population in the universities was disproportionate to their percentage in the community.
So the Tamil community had a lot of good education, but as I said, this was accidental. And they not only had a large number of positions in the civil service, in minor government service, a lot of them went abroad. And by the time the Sinhalese areas caught up with the creation of state schools and then missionary schools, the first was in 1851, a good 30 or 40 years after the North. So the result was there was very good education, and they tended to dominate the civil service.
When they take the Tamil areas, lands are limited, right? Every brother, father has to give a dowry for his daughter, sister. When the parents are not there, the brother's duty to find a dowry. You know what is dowry item? So if the parents are there, parents will have to find dowry. So for that purpose, with limited lands and other facilities, it was the only, education was the only way to go up, to get the government jobs.
I think many youngsters felt they had absolutely no alternative except to turn to violence. I think one of the problems, of course, as we find all over the world, is that political forces tend to use violent young people to make a point, and then this gets out of hand.
Now, the older men and women of the Federal Party at that time felt that they could not turn their back on the youth, but rather they hoped that they could co-opt them and lead them. But as they kept losing legitimacy by failing to make agreements stick between them and successive governments of Sri Lanka, the protest, the politics shifted out of parliament into the street.
By about the early 1970s, particularly with the university admission system being changed, one got the impression that the Tamil, particularly the younger Tamils, the youth, began to feel that they were not getting a fair deal, if you like, from the Colombo government.
So over a period of time, there were allegations about the Tamil community being discriminated. No doubt there were instances where there is justification to that claim. But I'm not too sure whether there is justification in the resort to arms.
A group within the Tamil community decided that this conflict cannot be resolved in the conventional methods, and they thought that maybe taking to arms was the way in resolving the conflict, fighting for their political rights, and with the ultimate aim of setting up a separate state within the small island of Sri Lanka.
And this was also the time of the breaking away of East Pakistan from West Pakistan in the early 1970s. And the Tamils saw that India sent its army and very easily broke up Pakistan. They thought the same thing could happen in Sri Lanka, that there could be a quick solution to the Tamil problem. India will send the army, break up Sri Lanka. So they decided to fight.
There was no way that without the approval of India that there would be ever an separate Tamil state in this country in the past, or for that matter in the future. And from the Indian perspective, encouraging a separatist state in the north in a way was somewhat suicidal, because the implications for India also are very bad. Because after all, if Sri Lanka can be split into a Sinhala majority and a Tamil majority state, there is no logical reason why Tamil Nadu should not have its own state, and so on.
All the Tamil people did not support the LTT. It was a minority which supported, but there was a large segment of Tamil people who remained silent because they dared not oppose the LTT. Because the LTT was a brutal organization which did not tolerate any form of dissent, particularly from within their community. And there are instances of top political leaders, top intellectuals who disagreed with the LTT being brutally killed.
And then what happened was the radicals took over, and you had people who never studied in their lives really, you know, not intellectuals, people who only know the way of the gun, taking over and started to even kill the intellectuals and so on. So they took the violence, people who advocated violence took the upper hand because the political process was not working.
What happened was this, is that the LTT was an absolutely fascist outfit which single-mindedly went out to destroy the leadership of every other militant group that existed. And the old political forces, the sort of non-violent political forces, were co-opted by the LTT.
That's how the Tamil democratic parties got marginalized. In addition, there was the factor that the LTT was a very violent political force. They not only eliminated every other Tamil guerrilla organization, they killed all the leaders of all the other parties. They also turned their guns against the democratic politicians. Their argument was, when a minority is fighting against a majority, there is no room for pluralism. We can't have many parties fighting for our freedom. One party must fight. We are the one party, and if anyone does not fall in line, we eliminate them. So that's how the democratic forces were completely eliminated, and the rule of the gun by the LTT took over in the north and east, terrifying the people.
Ironically, when the struggle turned from politics into terrorism, it so happened that the Jaffna Tamils were experiencing an unprecedented economic boom under the policies of the United Front government of 1970, because there was this import substitution strategy. And as a result of that, the farmers in Jaffna were able to make a lot of money. But it so happened that politics overtook economics.
The early expression of armed response came, unfortunately, in 1983, when 13 soldiers were killed. Now, very quickly, if I look at the time span, by 87, what began as a killing of 13 soldiers in 83 had become big enough for India to intervene by 1987. Sri Lankan government was on the threshold of taking Badamarachi, if I recall right. And so clearly the rebellion had grown strong enough to hold territory. It had led to a response by the government, which had led to an intervention by the Indian government, 87.
Then again, Indian government came with the political solution. The political solution meaning north and east one province, the provincial system. As in 1987 only, the 13th amendment created by the government.
Then in 1987, with the intervention of India, the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord was signed between the governments of India and Sri Lanka, and some sort of political power was devolved under the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Almost all the other Tamil groups other than the LTT laid down their arms and embraced the political process, and they have been part of the political process till today.
LTT did not accept those things because the LTT leader Pravaran was his mentality is there, his attitude is a separate country.
So I think we've come to a point now where most people, including the Tamil political parties, acknowledge that the LTT as a rebel group, as an armed group, had to be really defeated, through the force of arms.
Attitude of the government of Sri Lanka and those who were in charge of the war effort was a single-mindedness of purpose to achieve that victory and at whatever cost. Before this, you had situations in which governments of Sri Lanka prosecuting the war, perhaps not as efficiently or anywhere near as efficiently as this government did, nevertheless were constrained by local and international opinion that talked about civilian casualties, that talked about the need to pursue a political settlement through negotiation.
Peace talks were held as early as 1985 in Thimphu, Bhutan. Soon after the talks ended, the LTT used the strength it developed during the ceasefire to wipe out competing Tamil groups and continue fighting with the military. In 1987, with the mediation of India, the Indo-Lanka Accord was introduced and major changes to the constitutions were made. The 13th Amendment was introduced and the provincial council system was brought in as a comprehensive settlement for the problem.
The LTT never responded positively because the LTT's mindset was independence at all costs. Every LTT cadre who fought had to wear a cyanide capsule around his neck and swallow it in case he was captured. They specialized in suicide bombing. Unfortunately, except the leadership did not do that.
Mr. Premadasa tried to come to a kind of a negotiated settlement. That didn't work out. So then the LTT Sri Lanka government fighting resumed.
Different governments had different approaches. All the approaches were aimed at sharing power with the Tamil minority. But there was also another problem which becomes even more clearer in retrospect. I recall a statement made to his own cadres by the LTT leader, Vedapille Prabhakaran. He said that in our long journey, there are a few stops, and those stops are called peace talks.
The LTT used the 1990 peace talks to take over police stations in the east and murder more than 600 police officers who surrendered. It launched a full-scale military offensive attacking important targets. In 1993, it assassinated President Premadasa. In 1994, the government led by President Kumaratunga offered unconditional peace talks to the LTT. During this ceasefire, the LTT recruited more cadres and even obtained anti-aircraft capability. It shot down several aircraft and launched a large-scale attack on an army camp in Mullaitivu, killing more than 1,000 soldiers.
Then Mr. Wickramasinghe from the UNP won a parliamentary election while Chandrika Kumaratunga remained president. And then he called for a ceasefire with Norwegian facilitation. And again, negotiations were resumed, but that didn't work out.
After many years of war, the newly elected United National Front government signed a ceasefire agreement with the LTT in 2002. During the next 4 years, the LTT violated the Norwegian facilitated ceasefire more than 5,000 times. One of its snipers killed the foreign minister, Mr. Lakshman Kadiragama, in August 2005. Although the ceasefire was formally in place, there was no peace.
And I also explained several times, we try to get the political solution for our people. Otherwise, we can't get the separate country here. I explained properly, but he didn't understand, because he never understood. He tried to get the separate country. Then he used that situation between the peace talk period. He collect the money and he import the weapons. He again tried to strengthen the military.
And then came the next election, and Mrs. Chandrika Kumantunga left office, and Mr. Rajapaksa came. Again, for a time, negotiations were conducted even in Geneva. That didn't work out.
When it came to actually laying down of arms and going into a political settlement, the LTT basically backed out of it. So the peace negotiations came to a halt. And then when it came to a halt, the people in the south of Sri Lanka in particular got disillusioned by it. And they said, it looks like talking is not getting you any positive results.
4 previous presidents and 5 successive governments from different political parties tried many times to negotiate with the LTTE and reach a peaceful settlement. Third parties, namely India and Norway, also tried to mediate a negotiated settlement. None of these attempts succeeded because the LTT never had a genuine interest in peace.
Whenever LTT wanted to strengthen the people only, they went to the peace talk. Then that between the period, they strengthened again. Weapons, they bought the weapon, they trained the cadres, then they again fought. And then they strengthened. Like this, many incidents happened in Sri Lanka. That's what the last war happened. Then government didn't have any choice.
By and large, government, I think, has been absolutely sincere in negotiations. And if the clear evidence that you put forward, that the LTT walked out of everything, on several occasions they attacked us without warning, if people don't realize that that is wickedness, I think they are wicked themselves.
The new government also began down the same road. They called for talks with the LTT. There was one round of talks, but then those talks broke down.
Then LTT changed the tactics because they want to spread the army. Then they done the LTT intelligence being done the very bad things here. They selected the civilian target. They killed the civilian everywhere. Then government need their strategy, then government have to save the people, then they have to spread the army like that.
The LTT did not respond positively. Instead, it provoked the government with countless attacks on high-profile targets and innocent civilians, including a brutal attack at Kabitigollava, a remote village in the north-central province, which killed 64 people and injured many more. Despite this, the government maintained its commitment to the cause of peace until the LTT threatened a humanitarian crisis by shutting down the sluice gate at Mavilaru. This closure cut off water supply for a large agricultural basin as well as thousands of households. The government had no option but to intervene.
And it was becoming clear that there was some intransigency on the part of the LTT, which eventually made the government pursue a military path in trying to resolve the conflict.
It became clear that the LTT was gearing up for all-out war. It was only at this point that the government was compelled to expand the ongoing operation. That is how the humanitarian operations was launched.
if it was going to be a military solution, then the government did what had to be done. If it had to be a military solution, they had no other alternative as a military solution, because the LTT took the people with them. They did not let the people leave them. The problem the Sri Lankan Army finally faced was that the people and the LTT were mixed together, and the people couldn't leave. The LTT was not at the final stage letting the people leave, and there is evidence that the LTT fired on the people who tried to leave. So if the Sri Lanka government had to go in, there had to be civilian casualties. There was no other way. Other organizations, my organization, I myself, members of the international community, foreign countries, human rights groups said, it's not a military solution, negotiate. Get the LTT, persuade the LTT to surrender. That's what we said.
Those who say that a peaceful solution could have been pursued against the LTT are either ignorant or willfully blind to the history. The LTT never had any interest in peace. Its sole intention was to maintain its control on the people and lands of the north and east through the exercise of violence throughout the country.
LTT was surrounded and victory was imminent. At that point, the Western countries started to say, the costs are too high, stop this, negotiate, try to persuade LTT to surrender. There was a very major effort to persuade LTT to surrender, but the LTT didn't take that offer to surrender. LTT wanted a ceasefire, not to surrender.
Well, I think the important thing is to recognize that there are two issues. One is a war, which I believe was a very just war. We had to deal firmly with the terrorists, and we did so. And then we had to move swiftly towards reconciliation. Now, unfortunately, there are many people who will not accept the results of that war, including some members of the diaspora who don't really understand that the Tigers were more vicious to the Tamil people than to anyone else. And unfortunately, some members of the international community who, for whatever reason, are actually reviving the memories of the war from a very partisan standpoint.
Even in the report of that committee that was appointed by the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to about the Sri Lankan conflict, now it says a figure of, it mentions a figure of 40,000 who could have died. You know, but the dishonesty in all that, in the report, I think was brought out forcefully in the British Parliament.
I always make the distinction between the way the British government, under pressure from the Tamil diaspora, dealt with us in 2009, when you had a particularly nasty British government. The present one is much better, and they basically tried to attack us for war crimes. And when I said, why are you doing this? They said, oh, no, you know, we want to make sure that you treat the Tamils well. And the contrast is with the Indian government, which had been absolutely solidly supportive of our fight against terrorism, but never swerved from the position that we had to do what we could for the Tamils. And soon after the war ended, they got an agreement from the government to work together with them to resettle the displaced Tamil population as quickly as possible. So I think that is what is necessary, an approach that distinguishes these two factors, the just war against terrorism and the need to overcome some of the reasons that led even perfectly decent people to take up terrorist activities.
Some people outside genuinely have heard horror stories. So they have no way of checking these stories. So they believe these stories and sometimes they act on them. But when the media and institutions in whatever form, be the media or organizations and all, they have a greater duty to check out every aspect and give a balanced view.
Tamilnet allegations were only 78 civilian casualties. That is all, alleged by Tamilnet. Now the number went up substantially in January, February, March, never reaching the figures, of course, that the Times has claimed. But the first day on which you had a 3-figure allegation was this day on which the UN had said information, it probably comes largely from the LTT side.
I think the overseas Tamil lobby knew that their military operation here was gone, it's over. Then they had to seek a fresh avenue to advance their cause.
This figure really arose because some people in the UN system decided to set up their own extrapolated idea of how many people had died, and we first came across this in January when the then head of UN security seemed to have released some figures that were totally controversial, and we called him in immediately and said, what is the basis of these figures? The first lot only amounted to 38 or something on this figure of well over 1,000 he brought out. And I sat with him, I was Secretary of the Ministry of Human Rights at the time, and said, look, what evidence do you have? And then he said, well, actually we don't have any to say these were inflicted by government. For instance, there were some shells that fell into the area near the UN, and we don't know exactly where they came from. And he said, there's one that we can give you the trajectory. And then he told me this came from the LTT.
There indeed was a controversy at the UN itself about the numbers that died. Having said that, not only in Sri Lanka, in any conflict where there is a war, it's inevitable that civilian casualties do occur.
But war is the horrible things, not a wedding house or not like a birthday party or not like that. Lot of sorrow things are there behind the war. That's what I told, I explained the Pravakaran. We save the people, we develop our north and east. Anyhow, we try to get the political solution.
The US also put out a report in 2009, October, where they had documented so many instances where the LTT had shot people while trying to escape.
Surrendered LTT was treated humane. So civilians, I mean, of course, we knew that. So if you want to win the Tamils, we have to protect civilians. And most of our people were killed, soldiers were killed by trying to protect civilians, right? Actually, no, we led them, we told them, we sent down a number of leaflets, but of course we knew that the Prabhakaran was not letting them. They were shooting at them. Those who were trying to flee into this side, they were shot dead.
We first declared the no-fire zone in, I think, January 2009, and on that very day all this fighting started. People I've talked to kept saying how the LTT kept drawing weapons in and firing from there, and even more upsettingly, the Bishop of Jaffna has written to them on that very day saying, please take your weapons away from this zone. I mean, they used it. And of course this was part of their win-win situation, because they fire at us. What do? If you don't fire back, you're allowing your soldiers to be killed. If you fire back, you're being accused of killing civilians. But our army actually calibrated their attacks to such an extent that the number of civilian deaths was minimal. And as I said, even though there were collateral damage from our forces, the UN told us that most of the damage came from the LTT.
The civilians obviously came towards the army. They were rescued by the army. They wanted to come towards the army, and they were getting shot in the process, and that was seen on camera by so many Western ambassadors here. So the question is, if civilians were being massacred in such numbers by the army, would they want to come onto this side?
The head of the UN actually, who had called us that morning and said, look, you all are firing into the no-fire zone, check. We checked and we found that the army said they were not doing anything of the sort. He sent us an SMS that evening saying, for information, most of the firing this morning seems to have come from the LTT.
We had been trying to tell the LTT all the things that they are doing. They are not going to help you in the long run. Everything, especially the way they were killing people and recruiting minors, how do you call that, conscripting minor children. So these are things that we forcefully opposed and criticized in public. I told them, and finally when they were pressed upon by the forces, Sri Lankan forces, we told them that you please give up and save the people. You are keeping the people as shield of what do you call that, your human shield to protect yourself. Please allow them to go. They said no. We are fighting for the people. People must be here. That is what they are saying.
If they are proper liberation fighters, they have to release all the people, go out. They would have fought against the government, and in case if they die, people appreciate them now as a liberation fighters, but they didn't allow the people to escape from them. They used the people as a human shield. Then government responsibility rescue the people. That is a rescue operation.
Now, the reason I found this so irritating is this assumption is that only internationals care about casualties. I was head of the Peace Secretariat and I set up a system in 2008 where my staff monitored every single announcement on Tamilnet. And then I would ask the Army and the Air Force to give me an explanation for anything that seemed remotely improper. Now, these are the documents I had. They actually got these for me. This is air attacks by Sri Lankan Air Force on LT targets. And this is what my staff compiled. They may have missed something out, but when I showed it to Al Jazeera, they said, this is roughly what we have. Do you know, there were 400 odd air raids up to the end of 2008. And there were allegations of only 29 civilian deaths. And the majority of them were 1 or 2. That is not targeting civilians. When we took over the East, there was only 1 instance of civilian casualties. This was between 2006 and 2009. The Human Rights Watch published a report in which the headline said indiscriminate attacks on civilians. I went through the whole report and then I wrote to them saying, what are you talking about? You have only cited 1 instance in which civilians died. And you yourself admit that the LTT was in there with weapons. And the Sri Lankan Army admitted that it had fired, but it said they did it with mortar locating radar. It had fired back on the people who fired at it. So I think that's clearly evidence that this was a well-practiced technique of the LTT, and the fact that Human Rights Watch took up that technique, I think, makes them guilty of the LTT repeating it. Because of course, if in order to do this vicious thing of using your people as human shields and perhaps killing them, you have to have people either gullible or wicked enough to repeat the lie. And that is what Human Rights Watch did. They have a lot to answer for.
This final phase of the war started in 2006, where we captured the eastern province, right? Then we entered into this last phase, capturing the northern province. So by that time, when we started operations from Mana side, the Prabhakaran started taking these civilians with him, and no country talked about that, no, because he was forcibly taking them. When Prabhakaran was taking these civilians 3 years as a human shield, no country spoke, no Soldheim did not speak about it. Even the United Nations did not speak about the sufferings undergone by them. As military, we were suffering by floods and by rain and by the other diseases, the dengue fever and all that. How many soldiers were killed? So when you are moving through jungles, so same fate was awaiting the civilians. Nobody talked about it.
Human rights also became a commodity. And for instance, human rights, when I was young, was idealistic people, generally with a very anti-authoritarian streak. Sometimes it's led to anti-government feeling, Amnesty International and so on. But more recently, a lot of these so-called independent human rights groups are heavily funded by the same people that fund political parties in the West. Human Rights Watch is an obvious example of this.
The last moment, nearly 12,000 LTT cadres surrendered to the government. Now nearly 11,500 LTT cadres released by the government. We rehabilitated them, we given the vocational training them 1 year, now we release them. All this is the marvelous thing happened in Sri Lanka. Any other country so far didn't do like this. They are keeping the prison, they are facing the court case. Only 500 people only facing the court case here. That also open, transparency there.
With the success of the humanitarian operation, the unnecessary killing has stopped. Post-war reconstruction, resettlement and rehabilitation programs are near completion. Demining has been completed in almost all the critical areas. Towns and villages formerly under LTT dominance have seen tremendous development over the recent past. Internally displaced people have been very speedily resettled. Nearly 12,000 ex-LTT cadres who surrendered have been very successfully rehabilitated and reintegrated. So have the vast majority of cadres detained during the war.
So the government is taking the approach of restoring, rebuilding infrastructure which has been destroyed during the years of conflict in the conflict areas in the north and the east. For more reasons than one. One is that while the rest of the country had some level of development, these areas did not have that because the area was embroiled in an armed conflict.
On the aftermath of the conflict, there has been major destruction of the areas of the north and areas in the east of the country, and they clearly need to be reconstructed, rehabilitated.
Government is building good roads, government is building the government buildings that were brought down, government is putting up electricity, rebuilding water irrigation systems. Yes, the government is doing infrastructure building, and that the government is to be credited for that.
The former LTT cadre and their rehabilitation is pretty much complete. They're all out, literally all out, and I think there is the last 1,000 or so at the moment. There is a $3 million government fund which is available for providing microfinance for applicants from that group of people. So in a sense 90% or more are back home.
I mean, you have over 100,000 security force personnel stationed there 3 years after the war. There are some statistics which claim that there is, one soldier for every 8 citizens in Jaffna, and 1 soldier for every 4 citizens in the Vanni. This is higher than Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. Why?
What do you do with these men? You know, there is the army, there is the navy, there is the air force. Now, one thing that has happened is the government, instead of trying to demilitarize and trying to shrink the strength of the army, is deploying them in various development work.
With the conflict, the numbers in the military grow, and the conflict comes to an end, and what do you do with all these young people who have now become a part of the armed forces? Society has an obligation actually towards them also, and therefore they need to be gainfully employed.
Now the government's contention is that they are not interfering in the civilian life, and that they are there solely to carry out the responsibilities cast on them, which is to help in the development process and also the resettlement process after the separatist war.
I think the future will become better. It is much better today than it was 3 years ago. Life in Sri Lanka is much better.
Personally, I'm very positive and optimistic about the country. We have a very young and vibrant population. We will age in a few decades, one of the fastest aging countries in Asia, but at the moment we have a very young and vibrant population. I think people want peace, and I think they want development. I think without ethnic reconciliation, you really cannot develop the country. I think every Sri Lankan wants that. So I think eventually we will, in 10 years, I do see very strong steps towards reconciliation. Quite positive about the future.
I think we need to recognize that many have suffered with this conflict. We have lost soldiers on one hand, we've lost Tamil combatants on another hand, we lost innocent civilians on another hand. Whatever our political views have been, the wounds of the war will remain unless the nation comes to recognize that healing is required. And therefore the government has a role to play in it, but it also needs to bring civil society, religious leaders and others into this process of healing. Healing doesn't come easily. Healing takes time, but it will come.